You know, unlike the people who were forced to work, you aren't being forced to watch this video. Hello and welcome to applesauceisdelicious.com, and today we will be looking at our top 3 picks for impacts on slavery. We all love to hear of those great life stories like Solomon Northup from 12 Years a Slave and his struggle for freedom, but we hardly hear of any boycotts or riots that changed the way that we view slavery. So we did our research and have brought you our top picks of historical events that have changed the course of American slavery. The only criteria for this list is that these events must have happened before slaves were officially emancipated after the Civil War. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great man, but the riots that took place in his time are for another list. Number 3. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas? Although it sounds like a plague of some kind, it all really starts with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically took away the notion that slavery couldn't spread. The notion that slavery couldn't spread was actually addressed twice before, in the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. The tension between those who believed in free land and those who wanted slavery to expand for Kansas increased when Stephen Douglas signed a bill that left the fate of the land of Kansas up to a majority. Arguments between the Democrats and the Whigs, some of which directly fueled the Civil War, were really heating up. Meanwhile, on the ground, the fighting of the so-called Border Ruffians was taking place in what was coming to be known as Bleeding Kansas. Of course, today we only call it that in relation to this conflict, and one conflict was John Brown's raid on Pottawatomie Creek. This violent and bloody event settled what their counterparts were debating. More tension rose when President James Buchanan appointed a territorial governor and gave him orders to have the people of Kansas create a constitution and apply for statehood. Many free soilers, those who believed in freedom, lived in Kansas by now, and they boycotted the Constitutional Convention. They held a temporary capital in Lecompton. Voters had a choice between the two constitutions, neither of which were really too beneficial for slaves, although one clearly more than the other. One of the constitutions called for allowing the increase of slavery and importation of slaves. The other constitution called for no new slaves being brought over, but for the number of slaves to keep on growing. The voters in Kansas eventually rejected this idea altogether, and a split that never quite would be fixed was made in the Democratic Party.
Number 2. The Man, John Brown. The man was a fighter for the people chained up in the South, but would almost be considered a terrorist in our terms today. Confusing? We thought so too. But what he did might have been enough to open our country's eyes. The glassy-eyed and a little creepy-looking man shared his hatred for slavery at an abolitionist meeting, and vowed to end slavery at any means necessary. Later, he did just as he said, and took his 5 sons to the new territory in Kansas to attack pro-slavery residents. Fighting and killing many, he gained a reputation for himself with radicals in the North, but at the expense of losing one of his sons in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. John Brown never looked back, though. He began to form a small army of 18 men in 1858, who all believed what he believed, that arming slaves and starting a revolt would be the only way to end slavery. With this, they needed guns, and John Brown knew just where to get them. Harper's Ferry Armory, arsenal, and engine house, located deep within the heart of the South. John Brown went to work, but didn't really have a plan. He literally was going to raid this building with no rations and no escape plan. Having already failed before it started, it was a surprise that Harper's Ferry was taken over easily. John Brown then sent out a group of men who would contract slaves onto his side, as well as getting hostages, but his plan backfired. Instead of gaining slaves onto his side, he was surrounded by militias from neighboring towns. Fighting off all of them as fast as they could, they ended up losing as troops started to join the militias. John Brown was defeated with 8 of his men dead. He was put into prison right there in Virginia and was charged with treason. He then was executed on December 2nd. After his death, the South called him a traitor and viewed him as we would view a terrorist. But in the North, he was a hero. A martyr, almost. This, of course, opened the eyes of the country to see that their views on slavery were very different, creating a further split between the North and the South.